The smoke of the battlefield curled into the red sky as the screams of the wounded echoed through the ruined streets. Human soldiers moved quickly, pulling survivors from collapsed buildings and searching for enemy traps. Among the rubble, Sergeant Daniel Cross scanned the area with sharp eyes. He was used to war, but this place felt different. Something here was wrong in a way he could not yet explain. A sudden cry reached his ears. It was not in any language he knew, but the pain in it was clear. He pushed aside the broken wood of a shattered doorway and saw her. A young alien woman, skin a deep emerald green, hair white as snow, and eyes glowing faintly even in the dust-filled light. She was chained at the wrists and ankles, bruises covering her arms and face. Her clothes were torn but still covered her body, though they told the story of rough treatment and suffering. She tried to pull away when Daniel stepped closer. Her breathing was fast, her hands trembling. He raised his empty hand to show he meant no harm. The chain between her ankles rattled, and she flinched as if expecting a blow. Daniel felt a spark of anger, not at her, but at whoever had done this to her. No one deserved to be treated like this, no matter what species they were. The sound of approaching footsteps warned him that enemy patrols were close. Without thinking, he cut the chains with his combat blade and caught her when she nearly collapsed. She looked up at him with wide eyes, confusion mixing with fear. For a moment, neither spoke. He could feel her heartbeat racing against his chest as he carried her away from the danger. They moved through back alleys, avoiding the main streets where fighting still raged. Twice they had to hide in the shadows as enemy soldiers passed by. The alien woman clung to him, not out of trust, but because her legs were too weak to stand. Every so often, she would glance up at him with a questioning look, as if trying to understand why a human soldier would help her. Finally, they reached an abandoned shelter beneath a collapsed building. Daniel set her down gently, offering her a canteen of water. She hesitated, then took it with both hands, drinking carefully. When she spoke, her words were broken, mixed with a language he did not know. But he could hear her saying something like, "Why?" and "Why help?" Her voice was soft, as if unused to kindness. Daniel did not answer right away. He simply looked at her and said, "Because no one should be left like that." She stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes glistening in the dim light. Slowly, her hands lowered from their defensive position, and for the first time since he had found her, she seemed to breathe a little easier. Somewhere outside, the sound of distant gunfire reminded them that the war was not over. But in that small shelter, between a human soldier and an enslaved alien woman, something had shifted. Neither of them, he knew it yet, but their meeting would change both of their lives forever. Daniel kept watch at the entrance of the shelter, his rifle resting across his knees. The alien woman sat a few feet away, leaning against the cracked wall. She had pulled the blanket around her shoulders, but her hands still shook from the cold. Outside, the sound of distant engines and occasional gunfire told him the enemy was regrouping. Time was running out, and they could not stay here forever. She spoke again in her strange mix of words, pointing toward the north with a trembling finger. Daniel guessed she was trying to tell him something important. He shook his head to show he did not understand, but then she made a symbol with her hands, 2 circles crossing each other, and he realized she might be talking about a camp or a safe place. He crouched closer, drawing in the dust with his finger to confirm. She nodded quickly, her eyes wide with urgency. Daniel knew that moving through enemy-held streets with her in this condition would be risky. Still, staying here would be worse. He handed her a small packet of food, something soft and easy to chew. She hesitated at first, as if unsure if she was allowed to eat it. When he encouraged her with a small smile, she finally took a bite. Her eyes closed for a moment, and he could see the relief in her face. The sight stirred something deep in him, a quiet anger at what she had endured. They left the shelter before dawn, keeping to the shadows. The air was heavy with smoke, and the streets were littered with debris. Twice they heard the heavy boots of enemy patrols and ducked behind fallen walls until the sound passed. Daniel stayed alert, his senses sharp. The alien woman moved quietly despite her weakened state, her gaze constantly scanning as if she expected danger from every direction. She was not wrong. Danger was everywhere. At one point, they came across the body of a soldier in unfamiliar armor. The alien woman froze, her breathing quickening. Daniel stepped in front of her to block the view, guiding her away. He could feel the tension in her steps and the way she clutched her blanket tighter around herself. She was still afraid, but she was also moving forward. That small act alone told him she had a will to survive. When they reached a narrow alley, Daniel signaled her to stop. Ahead, 2 enemy soldiers were speaking in low voices. He motioned for her to stay hidden while he moved silently toward them. In a swift and practiced motion, he took them down without making a sound. When he returned, she looked at him differently. Less like a stranger and more like someone she could rely on. It was a small shift, but Daniel noticed it immediately. They pressed on until they reached the edge of the old market district. The buildings here were more intact, though many were burned. The alien woman pointed to a tall structure in the distance, repeating a word he could not understand but recognizing it as the same she had used earlier. Daniel guessed this was their destination. He gave her a reassuring nod, and they continued, each step bringing them closer to whatever hope she was clinging to. As they moved through the market ruins, Daniel noticed how her posture changed. She was still cautious, but she walked with a little more strength. Perhaps it was because they were getting closer to her goal, or maybe because she now believed she would not be abandoned again. For a brief moment, her green eyes met his, and there was something there he had not seen before. Gratitude. Quiet, but unmistakable. The sun was starting to rise higher, casting long shadows across the streets. Daniel knew that daylight would make them easier to spot. They needed to reach the tall building soon. He adjusted the strap on his rifle and looked toward her. She met his gaze and gave a small nod, as if to say she was ready. They stepped forward together, into whatever waited. Ahead, the closer they moved to the tall building, the heavier the air seemed to grow. Smoke drifted from the ruins nearby, and the faint smell of burnt metal lingered in every breath. Daniel kept his rifle ready, scanning windows and rooftops for movement. The alien woman stayed close to him, her bare feet silent against the cracked stone street. Every sound made her flinch, but she kept moving, determined to reach her destination. They stopped at a collapsed wall to rest. Daniel checked his map, trying to match the streets with the faint markings left by the war. The alien woman pointed, again toward the tower, repeating the same word in her language. Her voice carried a tone that told him this place was more than just a shelter. There was a personal meaning behind it, something important enough to make her risk the journey through dangerous territory. Daniel signaled for them to move again. As they passed a burnt-out transport vehicle, a shadow shifted in the alley to their right. He pulled her behind cover, just as a burst of energy fire sprayed the street. Enemy soldiers shouted in a harsh language, their boots pounding on the broken pavement. Daniel returned fire with controlled bursts, forcing them back. The alien woman clung to the wall, her eyes wide, until the sounds faded into silence. When the danger passed, Daniel motioned for her to follow. She stepped out carefully, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting more soldiers to appear. Her breathing was fast, but she was steady on her feet. He noticed her hands were no longer trembling as much as before. There was fear in her eyes, but also something harder. Resolve. It was a strength he had seen in human survivors of war, and now he saw it in her. They reached the base of the tall building just as the sun broke fully over the horizon. The light caught on the cracks in the walls and the shattered glass, making the ruins shimmer faintly. Daniel checked the doorway, then led her inside. The air was cooler here, heavy with dust. Their footsteps echoed softly as they moved through the wide entrance hall. She touched the wall with her fingertips, as if testing that it was real. They climbed a set of narrow stairs, the wood creaking under their weight. Halfway up, Daniel heard her whisper something under her breath. He turned, but she shook her head and kept moving. When they reached the second floor, she moved ahead of him for the first time. Her pace quickened as she led him down a long hallway lined with broken doors. She stopped at the last one, her hand hovering over the handle. Daniel gave a slight nod. She opened the door slowly, and inside was a small room with a single bed and a table. A cracked window let in a narrow beam of sunlight. In the corner sat a small metal box, dusty but untouched. She crossed the room quickly and knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the strange symbols etched into the lid. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing a bundle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped the bundle carefully, and Daniel saw what looked like a piece of intricate jewelry made from silver and green crystal. Her eyes softened as she held it, and for the first time, her expression was not fear or exhaustion, but something else. Memory. She looked at him and spoke softly, her words too fast for him to follow. But the way she pressed the object to her chest told him it was precious. Daniel did not ask questions. Whatever it was, it mattered enough for her to risk everything to get here. He kept watch by the door while she sat on the floor, cradling the item in her hands. Outside, the war still raged. But in that small moment, the world seemed distant. He knew they could not stay here long, yet he also understood she needed this time. For now, the mission was simply to protect her. Daniel kept his eyes on the hallway, while the alien woman remained on the floor, holding the crystal and silver piece close. The sunlight from the cracked window lit her pale hair, making it seem almost white gold. She sat in silence for several minutes, her breathing slow and steady now. When she finally looked up, there was a quiet strength in her gaze. She carefully wrapped the object again and placed it in a pouch she had tied around her waist. They left the small room and moved back toward the stairs. The air in the building felt heavier now, as if danger was waiting outside. Daniel moved, first, his rifle ready, scanning every corner. She followed closely, her steps soft but certain. When they reached the ground floor, he paused at the doorway to listen. Distant shouting echoed from the street, followed by the mechanical whine of a hover vehicle. It was getting closer. Daniel pulled her into the shadow of the entrance as a patrol passed by. Two soldiers in black armor walked ahead of a transport skimmer, their weapons held ready. The alien woman gripped the strap of her pouch as if afraid someone would take it. Daniel waited until the sound of the vehicle faded, before giving the signal to move. They slipped out into the side street, keeping low behind the broken walls and scattered debris. Their path took them through a narrow passage where vines had grown over the stone. The greenery swayed in the warm wind, carrying the faint scent of something sweet. For a brief moment, the world seemed calm. She reached out and touched one of the vines as they passed, her fingers brushing the small white flowers. It was the first time Daniel had seen her show interest in anything that was not survival, and it told him that she was beginning to feel more than fear again. A sudden crack of gunfire shattered the moment. Daniel pushed her down behind a pile of rubble, returning fire at the shadows ahead. Enemy soldiers had spotted them from a rooftop. His shots drove them back, but more were closing in from the far end of the alley. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward an opening between two buildings. They moved fast, the sound of pursuit close behind. Dust filled the air as stray rounds struck the walls around them. They emerged into a courtyard littered with the remains of old market stalls. Daniel spotted a doorway ahead and ushered her inside. The building was dark, the air thick with dust. They moved quietly through the empty space, their footsteps muffled on the wooden floor. Somewhere above, something creaked. Daniel raised his weapon, scanning the shadows. Then, a figure stepped into the light from an upper balcony. Not wearing enemy armor but the worn clothes of a civilian. The man above spoke quickly in a local dialect Daniel could not fully understand. But the alien woman's face lit up in recognition. She called up to him, her voice urgent but warm. The man disappeared for a moment, then reappeared at the top of a narrow staircase, gesturing for them to follow. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before leading her up. If she trusted him, there was a chance he could help them. Upstairs, The man led them into a room where the windows were covered with thick cloth. He offered them a small container of water and a piece of bread. The alien woman accepted with a nod of gratitude, breaking the bread into two and offering half to Daniel. He took it, feeling the weight of the gesture. Sharing food in the middle of war meant something, even across species. It was a sign of trust beginning to grow. The man spoke again, pointing toward the west and making the same two-circle gesture the woman had used earlier. Daniel realized they were not yet at her true destination. The tower had been a stop along the way, a place to retrieve something precious. The final goal lay further ahead, beyond the current battle lines. That meant more danger, but also the possibility of safety if they could reach it. Daniel looked at her and saw she was ready to continue. The man gave them a rough map drawn on a piece of cloth. It showed several streets marked with lines, likely enemy patrol paths, and a winding route toward the west. Daniel studied it closely, committing the turns to memory. The alien woman stood beside him, holding her pouch tightly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door as if she expected danger to break in at any second. They could not rest for long, but this shelter had given them a moment to plan. When they stepped back into the daylight, the wind had picked up. Dust swirled through the empty streets, stinging their eyes. Daniel led the way, moving from cover to cover. She followed without hesitation now, keeping close, but no longer clinging to him. The change in her movement was clear. She was no longer only surviving. She was moving with purpose. The pouch at her side swung gently with each step, reminding him that whatever was inside mattered deeply. They cut through a narrow alley and emerged near the remains of a fountain. The cracked stone basin was dry, but the sound of footsteps made them freeze. Daniel motioned for her to hide behind the fountain while he crouched low, peering around the edge. Two enemy scouts were walking slowly, scanning the area. He waited until they passed before signaling her to move again. Her quiet nod told him she understood the risk they were taking. As they moved deeper into the west side, the streets became more dangerous. Signs of recent fighting were everywhere. Burnt walls, shattered windows, and the smell of smoke in the air. They passed a building where the doorway was scorched black, and the alien woman slowed her pace. She looked at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Danielle placed a hand on her shoulder, and she gave him a brief glance before continuing on without a word. Near midday, they reached a section of the city where the buildings were taller and closer together. It was quieter here, but the silence felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Daniel kept his weapon ready, scanning the rooftops. The alien woman stayed close, her head turning as she checked the shadows. Her instincts seemed sharp, and more than once she noticed movement before he did. It was clear she had survived this long by being careful. They stopped at the corner of a large plaza. In the center stood a monument, cracked, but still standing. The alien woman pointed toward it, then toward a building behind it. Her eyes lit with recognition, and she spoke softly, repeating the same words she had said when they left the tower. Daniel guessed they were finally close to where she wanted to go. He motioned for them to move carefully across the plaza, using the broken pieces of the monument as cover. Halfway across, a shout rang out. Enemy soldiers emerged from the far side, raising their weapons. Daniel pushed her behind the base of the monument and returned fire. The sound of energy blasts echoed through the plaza, striking stone and sending fragments into the air. She stayed low, clutching her pouch, while Daniel fought to hold the soldiers back. One enemy went down, then another, but more were advancing from the left. He made a quick decision. Grabbing her hand, he pulled her toward the building she had pointed at. They ran across the open space, fire snapping at their heels. Bursting through the doorway, they found themselves in a dim corridor that smelled of dust and old wood. Daniel slammed the door shut behind them and moved forward, guiding her toward the stairs at the end. The enemy would follow soon, but for the moment they had a head start. They climbed quickly, their footsteps echoing off the stone. At the top floor, the alien woman stopped in front of a reinforced door. She reached into her pouch and pulled out the crystal and silver piece. With careful hands, she pressed it into a slot in the door's center. There was a faint hum, and the lock clicked open. She looked back at Daniel for the first time since they entered. Her expression filled with both relief and urgency. The door swung open slowly, revealing a room filled with dim, golden light. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by thin beams, coming through cracks in the boarded windows. At the center stood a raised platform with a small, sealed container resting on it. The alien woman stepped forward with careful, almost reverent movements. Her bare feet made no sound as she approached the container, her eyes fixed on it as if it were the heart of everything she had endured. Daniel followed, scanning the room for threats. The structure seemed stable, though the faint sounds of the battle outside reminded him they did not have much time. He watched as she set down the pouch and opened it, placing the crystal and silver piece on top of the container. A soft hum filled the air, and faint green light began to pulse across the surface. The lid slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing several small objects wrapped in dark fabric. She unwrapped one and held it out for Daniel to see. Inside was a carved stone pendant, marked with the same symbols that had been etched into the silver piece. Her hands trembled, but this time it was not from fear. She spoke softly in her language, her voice carrying weight and meaning, even if he could not understand the words. Daniel could tell this was more than a personal treasure. It was something she had risked her life to recover for her people. A sudden crash from below made them both freeze. The sound of boots and shouted commands echoed up the stairwell. Daniel moved quickly, grabbing his rifle and positioning himself between her and the door. She placed the pendant back inside the container and secured it in the pouch. When she looked at him, her gaze was steady. She knew the enemy was coming, but she also knew she was not alone anymore. The first enemy soldier burst through the doorway. Daniel fired, dropping him instantly. Another tried to push forward but was met with a sharp burst of fire. The alien woman crouched low behind the platform, clutching the pouch to her chest. The air filled with the sharp smell of scorched metal and the deep thud of weapon fire. Daniel fought with precision, every movement aimed at keeping the enemy from reaching her. A blast struck the wall near the window, sending shards of wood and stone across the floor. Daniel grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the opening. Below, the drop was steep but survivable if they landed right. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. He went first, hitting the ground hard but steady, then caught her as she jumped. Enemy shouts followed, and a shot rang out, striking the wall beside them as they ran. They dashed through the narrow alleys, weaving between broken buildings. The sound of pursuit grew fainter with each turn they took, but Daniel knew they were not safe yet. The alien woman ran without slowing, her grip on the pouch never loosening. Her breathing was quick, but her steps were sure. She was no longer the fragile figure he had found chained in the ruins. She was stronger now, driven by purpose and the hope of reaching safety. After nearly 10 minutes of moving through the maze-like streets, they reached a hidden courtyard. A rusted gate stood at the far end, half covered in vines. Daniel pushed it open and ushered her through, then closed it behind them. The sound of the outside world was muffled here, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. For the first time in hours, there was no immediate threat pressing down on them. She leaned against the wall, catching her breath. When she looked up at Daniel, there was a spark in her eyes that had not been there before. It was not just gratitude. It was trust, solid and unshaken. She placed her hand over her chest, then pointed at him and spoke a word slowly, as if wanting him to remember it. Though he did not know the meaning, he understood the feeling behind it. They were no longer strangers. They were allies. Daniel checked the courtyard carefully before allowing himself to relax. The walls were high, and the overgrown plants provided enough cover to hide them from view. The alien woman had found a small stone bench and sat down, her pouch still clutched against her side. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, but also the determination that kept her moving. They had survived the last attack, but the journey was not over. She motioned for him to sit beside her, When he did, she opened the pouch just enough for him to see the carved pendant again. This time, she pointed to the symbols and then to herself, tapping her chest twice. Then she pointed west, making the same two-circle gesture he had come to recognize. It was clear now. The pendant was part of something larger, and the place she wanted to reach was connected to it. Whatever it was, it had meaning for her people. Daniel considered their position. They were deep in enemy territory, and while the courtyard offered momentary safety, they would need a clear route to the west. He unfolded the cloth map they had been given earlier, studying the paths and obstacles. The alien woman leaned closer, pointing to one section where the lines crossed. Her finger tapped twice, and he understood. It was a checkpoint. If they tried to pass through directly, they would be seen. They decided to move at night. Until then, Daniel set about checking his gear and making sure his rifle was ready. The alien woman searched the courtyard quietly, returning with a handful of small fruits from a vine. She handed him a few before eating one herself. The taste was bitter, but not unpleasant, and it gave them both a little energy. It was a simple act, but sharing food again reinforced the unspoken bond between them. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the courtyard. Daniel kept watch while she rested, her head leaning against the wall. The quiet was strange after so much chaos, but he knew it would not last. When night finally fell, they slipped through the rusted gate and into the darkness. The streets were quieter now, but the risk was still high. Every distant sound made them pause and listen before moving on. They approached the checkpoint from a side alley. Two enemy guards stood by a low barricade, their weapons slung casually. Daniel studied their movements, noting the rhythm of their patrol. When the moment came, he moved quickly and silently, taking them down before they could react. The alien woman stayed back until he signaled it was safe. She stepped over the barricade with careful movements, her eyes scanning the road ahead. Beyond the checkpoint, the streets grew narrower and more uneven. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint smell of damp earth. She led the way now, moving with more confidence. Twice she stopped to listen, and each time they avoided danger by taking a different route. Daniel realized she knew this part of the city better than he did. Her knowledge was as valuable as his skill with a rifle. They came to a small bridge spanning a shallow canal. On the other side, a row of old stone buildings stood in silence. She crossed quickly, pausing only once to glance back at him. He followed, his boots making soft sounds against the worn stones. The night air was still, but Daniel could feel the weight of the mission pressing on them both. Whatever lay ahead, it was close now. Finally, they reached the edge of a large open field. Beyond it, in the faint light of the moon, Daniel could see the outline of a structure unlike the rest of the city. Its walls curved upward, and strange patterns glimmered faintly on its surface. The alien woman stopped and looked at him, her expression unreadable. She placed her hand on his arm and gave a single nod before stepping forward toward the open ground. They moved across the open field slowly, staying low and using the uneven ground for cover. The alien woman kept her eyes fixed on the curved structure ahead, her movement steady and sure. Daniel stayed close, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The air was cold, and the faint sound of distant engines reminded him that the enemy was never far away. Still, every step brought them closer to the end of this journey. As they reached the base of the structure, Daniel realized it was far larger than it had appeared from a distance. The walls were made of a smooth, dark material that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Strange patterns pulsed faintly along its surface, glowing in time with the beat of a heart. The alien woman approached a small archway and pulled the carved pendant from her pouch. Her hands were steady as she pressed it into a circular panel beside the entrance. The panel lit up, and the archway slid open with a low hum. A warm light spilled out, bathing them in gold. Inside, the air was clean and carried a faint floral scent. Daniel followed her in, keeping his weapon ready just in case. The walls inside were covered in more glowing patterns, and the floor was smooth beneath. Their feet, the place felt untouched by war, as if it existed in another world entirely. She led him down a long corridor to a wide chamber where several figures stood waiting. They were taller than her, their skin a paler shade of green, and their clothing was lined with silver threads. One of them stepped forward, speaking in her language. Her face lit up with relief as she answered quickly, holding up the pouch. The elder figure took it carefully, opening it to inspect the contents. His expression softened, and he placed a hand over her shoulder. Daniel stood back, watching the exchange. He could not understand their words, but he could see their meaning. This was a reunion, and the pendant was more than a personal treasure. It was a key to something greater. The elder turned to Daniel and gave a slow nod of respect. Another figure stepped forward and offered him a small emblem made of the same crystal as the pendant. It was light in his hand, yet carried weight beyond its size. The alien woman stepped toward him then, her eyes bright. She placed her hand over her heart, then touched his arm gently. She spoke his name for the first time, her voice soft but certain. Then she pointed to the emblem in his hand and said another word, one he could not translate but understood in spirit. It was a word of gratitude and of bond, one that went beyond the barriers of language. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Around them, the other figures moved with quiet purpose, securing the chamber and sealing the entrance behind them. The elder gave orders in a calm tone, and the light in the walls shifted slightly. Daniel realized this was a safe place, one the enemy would not easily find. The alien woman's people had been waiting for her, and now she had returned with what they needed. Daniel knew his mission with her was complete, but he also knew he would not forget this. He had seen her change, from a beaten prisoner to a determined survivor, from someone barely able to stand to someone who walked into her home with her head held high. He had only been a protector at first, but somewhere along the way they had become more than that. They had become allies, and perhaps something even stronger. As the first light of dawn touched the sky outside, Daniel prepared to leave. The alien woman walked him to the entrance, the pendant now safe in the hands of her people. She placed the emblem back in his hand and closed his fingers around it. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. This was a promise, one that if their paths crossed again, it would be as friends who had faced the fire together.